This is Energy Flow in the Ecosystems, part 3 of 3. In this session, we're going to be discussing more about energy pyramids. So let's go ahead and get started. An energy pyramid is a diagram that shows the amount of energy that moves from one feeding level to another in a food chain. Now, the most energy is going to be available at the bottom level of the pyramid. That would make sense because the bottom level of the pyramid is the biggest visually if you looked at a pyramid. And so when you think of something that's bigger, you usually think this that has the most. Okay, and as you move up the pyramid, each level has less energy than the level below. So let's take a look at this energy pyramid. Okay, so if you look at this pyramid, you see that first you have at the bottom your producers. Your producers are going to have the most energy. And then you'll have your herbivores that eat your producers. They're the first level consumers. They're going to have a little bit less energy. They're going to receive a little bit less than what the producers had originally. And then they have even less energy or receive even less energy at the second level consumer because here are your prairie dogs. And then at the very top, a third level consumer, you have usually a larger consumer, like this owl, and they receive even less energy from the second level consumer that they're consuming. So why does that happen? Why do they get less energy? Well, let's go back and find out. Well, only about 10% of the energy at one level of a food chain is transferred to the next feeding level. So only 10% of the energy is then transferred to the next feeding level. The other 90% of that energy is used for the organism's life processes, or it could also be lost to the environment as heat. So all the energy that organism has, 90% of it's used to keep that organism living, this life process. So living, growing, reproducing, all of those things that is considered a life process, or it could be lost to the environment as heat. Now, when that organism gets eaten, only 10% of its energy is then passed to whatever eats it. So since about 90% of the energy is lost at each step, there is not enough energy to support many feeding levels in an ecosystem. So whenever I discuss with you how really you only have maybe up to a third level consumer, and very rarely will there ever be a fourth level consumer in a food chain, that's the reason why. Because if you think about how much energy there was to start with your producers, and as it decreases by 90%, that 90% is lost every time, and only 10% is passed on to the organism that's eating the other organism, there's not a lot left when you get to the top. So that's why there's not a lot of feeding levels, and it only goes up to maybe 3 levels. So that would lead you to believe that there's few organisms that are going to be at the top of that energy pyramid. So not very many great, huge top of the food chain consumers. So why is that? Well, since so much energy is lost, it limits the amount of consumers an ecosystem can support. Third level consumers still need as much energy as second or first level consumers. And so usually they're going to have to eat more organisms than a first level consumer would have to consume in order to get as much energy as it needs to function. If we had a lot of organisms at the top of the food chain, they would need a huge food supply just so they would be able to function and get the energy that they need, because they're not getting it as much when they eat. And so that would cause a huge problem, because they would eat and eat and eat, and there wouldn't be a lot of other organisms left. And so then those third level consumers would die out as the population of their prey decreases because they overate. So that's why there's not very many third level consumers, because there's just not enough energy in the ecosystem to support so many large third level consumers, because they need to eat so much just to get the energy they need to be able to function. Since as they went up the energy pyramid, they kept losing and losing energy. So let's take a look at this energy pyramid again. And again, you have this on your guided notes. This is more of a smartboard drag and drop activity to help you label, but we'll go ahead and go through that now. So you have at the bottom your producers. An example of your producers might be grass, okay? And at the bottom here, we know that you have the most amount of energy. So producers, that's the organism that has the most amount of energy because they're making their own food. Now, when the first level consumers eat your producers, okay, they're passing on 10% of their energy. So what would be a first level consumer? Well, it might be a mouse. And a first level consumer would be called a primary consumer. Okay. And then your second level consumer would be eating your first level consumer. So what would be considered a second level consumer? Well, a prairie dog, our favorite organism. And because it's a second level consumer, it could also be called a secondary consumer. And on the top of the energy pyramid, you have your third level consumers, which could also be called tertiary consumers. An example of that would be the owl. Okay, the owl would have to eat a lot of prairie dogs for it to be able to be filled up and have enough energy to function. So there's not as many owls as there would be prairie dogs or mice, because there would be a lot of primary consumers because they don't need to eat a lot to get the energy that they need. Okay, but at the top, we know that they have the least amount of energy, because every time they go up a step, they lose 90% of that energy to their life processes and also to the environment as heat, and only 10% is getting passed from the grass to the mouse, and only 10% of that is getting passed from the mouse to the prairie dog. Then only 10% of that is getting passed from the prairie dog to the owl. Now, there's a common misconception with 7th graders that energy pyramid is the same as a food pyramid. So let's debunk that right now. Let's take a look. This is an example of our energy pyramid that we talked about. Remember, you have your producers, a lot of first level consumers, not quite as many second level consumers, and a third level consumer, and not very many third level consumers. You can also see the energy. So 1,000 kilocalories is how much energy the producer would have. But whenever the consumer, first level consumer, would eat the producer, they would only have 100 kilocalories. So it decreased, and only 10% got passed. So when the second level consumers eat a first level consumer, it's only getting 10 kilocalories from that little mouse. And when the third level consumer, like this big owl, eats a prairie dog, it's only getting 1 kilocalorie per prairie dog. So that's not very much, and that's why you can't have very many of these big consumers, because think about how much the owl's going to need to eat to be able to function properly. So that's the energy pyramid. Now, food pyramid, Okay, I know you think, well, they're eating, that's food. Well, this is what a food pyramid is, and is telling you how much you should eat of what type of foods. So how many pastas or vegetables or fruits or milks and yogurts and cheeses or eggs and nuts, and how many fats. So they're completely different. They're not really related in this way. So just so you know, in this unit, we're discussing the energy pyramid. And in food pyramid, that's probably something you'll talk about in health class. Okay, if you need to rewind any of this, please go ahead and feel free to do so. But this is the conclusion of our energy flow in the ecosystems unit and the end of part 3 of 3. Thank you for listening.